Okay, I just thought of this now. So this week's Parsha Miketz details the story of when Joseph was taken out from prison and to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and then he becomes the viceroy over all of Egypt, Pharaoh's right-hand man, and he gathered all the grain for the impending 7-year famine. And everyone basically, if they wanted grain, they could give jewelry, they had to pay for it in kind, and so he was very trusted. So the point is, from the depths of despair, from being almost left in someone's it was in prison, left to, I mean, they put them there because they no one wants to have anything to do with them, to becoming such a powerful figure. Things can change in someone's life. I mean, and we have to try and believe that it's not easy to have emunah that things can turn for the better. And this is exactly what happened. And I think this is as a side point, this is the first case of good Jewish business acumen, where Joseph successfully helped Egypt avoid starvation during that 7-year period, using his business acumen, the Jewish business cop. So I think this could have been the first case of that. Damon, do you think, I don't think there's any other case, or maybe there is. So that's about the Jewish business savviness, should we say?
And the lack of goyish response of appreciation.
Yeah, that I'll talk about another time. That I'm gonna talk about.
Building the entire economy, we lose rights as citizens and we're enslaved.
And they conveniently forget. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they conveniently forget the contribution of what the Jews have done to countries, and eventually it leads to their own detriment.
Correct. The same thing happened in South Africa. The Jews are the ones who got Mandela out and did everything for the ANC, and
built the economy.
Yeah, Helen Suzman, they got up in Parliament, and the EFF and the ANC said that, she really didn't do much for anybody, and you know what? Just basically nothing was appreciated by Kamm, nothing. Anyway, listen, before we get started on the Gemara share, there's just two things I wanted to let you know of. Is that because tonight is the 5th night of Hanukkah, there are two special things that you've got to understand. It's known as a Yom Kippur Katan. So, because it's the day before Rosh Chodesh Tevet, and the day before every Rosh Chodesh is known as almost a mini Yom Kippur, because it's a day of introspection and repentance for any wrongdoing during that past month. And it's almost as if that new month is a new opportunity. So that's you've got to bear in mind. But there was something interesting. I remember learning from Rabbi Dan Brody that I'm just giving my share at the moment, Rabbi Yisrael. All right. Guys, I've just got to move my car. All right.
We'll pause the recording.
It's just first a sec. So Dan taught us, I don't know if you remember, that on the 5th day of Hanukkah, the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, who was the founder of Chabad Hasidut, he was released from his second imprisonment in the year 5561. So it's a day of miracles, apart from Rosh Chodesh Katan. Yom Kippur Katan. All right, guys, let's just go through things. I know Arthur's going to have to go just now, and we'll end off at that point. I just don't want to just talk for the sake of talk. Let's just get through to it. So, just quickly, if you remember that Rav Yosef was saying that it was a pre-Yush despair situation and a post-Yush despair situation. And Rav, in the name of Rav Chia, wasn't arguing against Rav Yochanan, who said in the name of Rav Yanai, because according to Rav, the claim of the owner is only against the thief, when the thief is discovered. Whereas according to Rav Yochanan, the claim is also against the buyer, the purchaser. So obviously the way Rav Yosef resolves it is it's a pre-Yu'ush situation or post-Yu'ush. After the owner despairs, it belongs to the buyer with a change of domain. Therefore, there's no claim that the victim can also have against the buyer. Now, a buyer doesn't agree with Rav Yosef, and he said, look, there's also a case where if the sale was made before the owner's despair, there's also an argument there. So you can't say it's a pre-despair, post-despair sort of situation. It has to do with a deeper concept, because according to when you're dealing with let me just put it in a simple way. If you're looking at the pasuk in Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 3, the Torah gives a commandment that a non-Kohen who slaughters an ox, a sheep, or goat for non-sacrificial purposes is to give the right foreleg, jaws, and maw, which is the esophagus and other areas of the head, to the Kohen. So if a butcher slaughters an animal and then sells those Kahanic gifts, they're not his to sell. It's in fact stolen from the Kohanim. So that's the equivalent of a pre-Yush situation, since the Kohanim have not despaired of retrieving those gifts, according to Rashi. Okay? So, in that particular case, there is an argument, and that argument was in Chulin 132a. So, we learn in the Mishnah, if one said to a butcher, sell me the innards of a cow, and the Kohanic gift were among them, the buyer gives the gifts to the Kohen, and the butcher doesn't deduct the value of the Kohanic gifts from the purchase price, because it can be assumed that the right leg and the jaw wasn't included in the sale, since both the buyer and seller know it has to be given to a Kohen. So in this case, there's no theft at all. That's not the issue we're talking about. However, if he bought the cow's innards from the butcher by weight, and the buyer gives the Kohanic gifts to the Kohen, and he deducts their value from the purchase price, that's reasonable. Because what we're saying is, if the buyer bought a certain weight of innards, the sale does include the maw, which constitutes theft from the Kohen. So the buyer has to give the maw to the Kohen, and the Kohen need not pay him anything for it. But he's entitled to claim from the butcher the money he paid for the maw, because it wasn't the butcher's to sell. Okay? Now, Rav said in explanation of the last ruling, which implies that the buyer can collect compensation only from the butcher and not from the Kohen. So they taught that the buyer has no right to compensation from the Kohen only when he weighed the innards for himself, because in that case, it wasn't it was the buyer who initiated the theft with the maw and not the butcher, because he was in control of weighing and separating the innards for himself. But if the butcher weighed the innards for him, the claim of the Kohen is against the butcher, not against the purchaser. And he can only sue the butcher. And if he wants to collect the gifts from the buyer, he's got to pay for them and then sue the butcher for that financial equivalent. So it seems as if Rav is saying that the claim then is only against the initial butcher or the thief in this regard, but not against the purchaser. Whereas Rav Yosef is saying it's either pre-Yu'ush or post-Yu'ush, according to Rav Chisda. So how would he reply to this? And he's saying, look, all we're trying to say is that Rav, according to Rav Yosef, means that the claim of the Kohen is also against the butcher. And the reason why we have to teach the obvious is that you might have thought Kohanic gifts cannot be stolen, because by divine right, they go to the Kohen, so that gift from Hashem is so strong to the Kohen. Even if somebody else has them in their possession, it's not constituted as theft. It's only in the care of somebody else until it's returned. And Rav informs us otherwise. And in fact, if it's not going to the right party, it is theft. Because Hashem says don't steal. And if people are stealing, you could say, but Hashem's law is so strong, then surely how can we go against that law? And the answer is that we have free choice. So therefore, if there's free choice, there is that concept of the avera, the sin, versus the following the instruction and doing the right thing. So the Gemara explains how Abai would understand the opinion of Rav and Rav Yochanan. Because we're saying, okay, so how would he work this out? And in a nutshell, Abai stated earlier that Rav and Rav Yochanan actually disagree, even when the sale was made pre-Yush. There's no issue after the Yush. There's no claim against the buyer, because Rav rules that only a thief can be sued, whereas Rav Yochanan maintains that the buyer or any third party can be sued as well, as long as they prevent the original owner from getting their item, whether they consume it or otherwise, or they break it. So, according to Abai, who said that they disagree, in what point do they disagree? And they disagree about Rav Chisda's ruling. In other words, Rav Chisda holds that if somebody consumes or buys stolen property before Yush, the owner has the option of suing either a third party or the original thief. And Rav Yochanan, from Abai's perspective, accepts Rav Chisda's ruling, but Rav disagrees with Rav Yochanan and has no claim against the purchaser or the third party that consumes. Okay, so that's Abai's explanation. There's a third explanation, and that is, I'm aware that Arthur's got to go soon, so I'm going as quickly as I can. Arthur's working very hard.
Damon, just going back.
Yeah.
Did the butcher steal those innards originally? How did the butcher get possession of all of those parts that were meant for the Kohen? So, how did the butcher buy it from a thief, or did he steal it? He or she steal it themselves?
Okay, excellent question. So the butcher buys it from the abattoir, but what the butcher is meant to do is it's meant to be separated, the foreleg, the jaw, and the maw, to give to the Kohen. In terms of the butcher losing the money, in terms of the value, well, believe me, you can take the whole animal and then weigh it proportionately according to what's left and make the desirable markup, so he doesn't technically lose. But if he's selling that which he cannot sell, Kevin, that's the theft. It's not that he's buying it from the thief, it's that he's stealing it from the Kohen by depriving the Kohen of his right to those parts of the animal, which is an excellent question. It's an excellent question.
He's the custodian for the Kohen. He shouldn't. He has to give it over to the Kohen. That's what he's supposed to do.
And if he does the right thing, so either he's profiting, or if he lets the purchaser weigh the innards for himself, and the Kohen comes to him, the buyer's going to say, "Listen, go to the butcher's going to say, go to the buyer. He has your item, and he needs to return it to you." So
is he he's an unpaid custodian? Was he a paid custodian? Remember?
No, he's not. He's not paid to look after it at all. Hashem has made the butcher and the abattoir responsible for making sure the Kohen gets what's theirs. So it is like an unpaid custodian, you could say. In fact, it's a custodian for the Kohen. I think that's a reasonable explanation. So, a third explanation of the difference between Rav and Rav Yochanan. So, according to Rav Zevid, okay, both Rav and Rav Yochanan subscribe to Rav Chisda's ruling. He agrees with Rav Yosef. So if the owner is not yet despaired, they would agree that he has a claim against the buyer or third party as well. But Rav Zevid has a slightly different point to Rav Chisda in terms of specificity of when Rav Chisda's law applies. So according to Rav Chisda, there's no timeline issue. If you've got a change of domain with the consumption or with the consumption prior to despair, it doesn't matter if the change of domain has taken place before the despair or after the despair. In other words, whether you consume the cookies at the thief's house or whether the thief comes to your house and you both consume the cookies together. Doesn't matter the order. Rav Zevid said it does. Because the cases where the owner despaired after the stolen property was in the possession of a buyer. And he did not despair when it was still in the possession of the thief. So what we're basically saying here is the change of domain, in other words, the transfer of property from the thief's possession to the buyer's possession, preceded the owner's Yu'ush. Now, that's the issue where they have a problem. Because Rav Yochanan holds that, who's the master, if there was that first despair, and concept-wise, in other words, I, as the original owner, despair of getting my item back, and afterwards a change of domain goes from the thief to the buyer, the buyer acquires the stolen property. So Yu'ush, despair, has to occur before the change of domain. However, if there's a change of domain and afterwards there's despair, in other words, it goes from the thief to the buyer, and then the victim hears about it and despair occurs afterwards, he does not acquire it. Because why should the buyer benefit, according to Rav Zevid, if it's a natural disposition to give up, when in fact, why should the buyer get that protection? And where the change of domain preceded Yu'ush, the buyer did not acquire the goods. And accordingly, if Rav Zevid's applying Rav Chista's principle, the buyer can be sued. And Rav holds different to Rav Yochanan. He said it doesn't matter whether Yu'ush transpires first and then there's a change of domain, or a change of domain occurs first and then Yu'ush despair occurs. Whichever order it happens, the buyer acquires the stolen goods, either way. In other words, and since the buyer now owns the stolen property, because Yu'ush triggers acquisition for the buyer, the original owner cannot demand its return, even if he's willing to make restitution and pay for it. He can't demand it. They could come to some arrangement. So, guys, can you reiterate Rav Zevid's point? Kevin?
Can't give it over. I think Gavin, have a go. Sorry.
No problem, Kev. That's what we're here.
I mean, you were talking about. Sorry, I had to just plug something into my computer, and I lost the last minute that you said.
That's not a problem.
You were saying if there was no Yu'ush, then somebody has no recourse against. I didn't get if it was the buyer or the purchaser. I mean, the owner, the original owner, or the purchaser. I missed that part.
No, we're not saying that. Let me just say it once again, because Arthur's also driving and he might have missed it, which is normal. I mean, I want him to concentrate on the road, so he can, please God, live to see another year. That's important. So, what I was saying, Kevin, is quite simple. According to Rav Chista, generally the third party that consumes the goods of the victim has to make restitution, even though he's not the actual thief. He's deprived the original victim of what's his. So if you go to a friend for a braai and your friend stole the steak and you consumed the steak, it's a bit miserable compared to getting a free steak. You have to buy the victim a new steak, but guess what? You ate it, so it's not the end of the world. Now, Rav Zevid is a bit more specific about this incident as far as the argument between Rav and Rav Yochanan. So Rav Zevid, Kevin, is saying Rav Yochanan says that if there's first Yu'ush, despair, and afterwards a change of domain, the buyer acquires the stolen property and there's no claim against the buyer. But if there was a change of domain first to go from the thief to the buyer, and afterwards there's despair on behalf of the victim, the buyer doesn't acquire it, and therefore the buyer has to return it to the original owner for no compensation. But Rav is holding different to Rav Yochanan. He says there's no difference either way about whether despair occurs before a change of domain or afterwards. The buyer acquires the stolen goods, and therefore the victim is not entitled to it as long as Yu'ush has taken place. Do you get it?
The victim's the original owner.
Yeah. If you
But if
don't
Yosh takes place,
if you don't
he's given
have,
up his rights to the item.
yeah, but I'm hoping, Kevin, you can just give it over.
I'll try. I can give
Yeah, try.
um
What's this issue with Rav Zevid? What does he say the difference is between Rav Yochanan and Rav?
the difference.
Yeah.
It's about well, I'll give over the facts. I can't I'll try and give over. So if there is Yehush, the buyer, if the buyer obviously change, if the item comes into his possession, it's obviously in a different location, then it's his property. Then the original owner has no recourse.
According to whom?
Rav Zevid, I think, is it?
No, all right. I'm going to say it one more time because it's not an easy concept.
I don't always remember. I don't always remember the name. It's
let me say it over very simply. It's not a problem. Okay, so obviously Rav Yochanan is of the different opinion to Rav, because the Mishnah stated that Rav is saying that the claim of the owner is only against the thief. Rav Yochanan says that the claim of the owner is against either the thief or the buyer when the thief is discovered. Either way, because the buyer is not protected by the remedy of the marketplace, because as far as both Rav Yochanan and Rav is concerned, when the unidentified thief is discovered, you can sue the thief. So Rav is saying that your claim is only against the thief. There's no protection of the marketplace where the buyer has to be compensated. You get what I'm saying. And if the buyer has got the item, he has to return it. But if in that particular case, if there is the protection of the marketplace, then in that particular case, Rav is saying that you can only sue the thief for the money that you paid the buyer. But according to Rav Yochanan, if the purchaser has bought the item from the seller and that seller's identity was discovered, because the identity was discovered, the buyer can sue the seller, who happens to be the thief, to get his money back. Do you understand, Gav?
Yeah. Not excellently, but reasonable.
the thief.
All right, so Kevin, listen, before we go to Rav Zevid, all we are saying is this. At the time where the thief is not identified, because a guy had a stall at the Rosebank flea market, and then at that point he spent a whole day selling stolen goods and he can't be traced, then the thief's identity is hidden, and therefore the buyer's got the remedy of the marketplace, that he is entitled to be compensated from the original owner should the original owner want his item back. Okay, the minute the thief's identity is discovered and the Rosebank flea market figures out who this guy is, because they took photos of him in the camera and they had an old cell number or whatever it is, now the buyer, Gavin, has got recourse against the seller and he's not entitled to compensation from the original owner. That's all we're saying. That's all we're saying. So that's the first part of the statement. The second part of the statement, according to Rav, is that should the original owner, once the thief has been discovered, his only claim can be against the thief, because he's got recourse against the very person that stole it. According to Rav Yochanan, the claim of the owner is also against the buyer. Why? Because the thief's identity could have been discovered, but who has the item at the moment? Who has the item is the buyer. The buyer has to relinquish that item immediately to the original owner, and the buyer has to sue the seller for his money back. You see, That's according to Rav Yochanan, Gavin. Pretty clear, right? Now, Rav Yosef is saying it's only talking about that they're both in agreement. It's only talking about pre-Yush or post-Yush. Pre-Yush, you can sue the buyer. Post-Yush, you can't. You have to compensate the buyer. A buyer is a purchaser in this case. Now, when we're talking about a buyer, A-B-A-Y-E, then in that particular case, he's saying different as far as it's not an issue of pre-Yush and post-Yush, because with Kohanic gifts, it depends who's responsible. If the butcher's responsible, you sue the butcher. If the buyer is responsible and weighs the innards for himself, you sue the buyer. So it depends which party is responsible or more responsible, okay? Now, then there's this case of Rav Zevid, and Rav Zevid is basically saying that Gavin and Kevin, it's a bit more complicated than Rav Chisda, that the third party is responsible pre-Yush, pre-despair. Rav Zevid said it depends what occurred first. The Yush, or in the timeline, according to Rav Yochanan. So Rav Yochanan said if the change of domain preceded Yush, okay, in that particular case, it matters. There is no acquisition for the buyer. Again, Rav Yochanan, according to Rav Zevid, is saying that if the change of domain preceded the Yush, it doesn't belong to the buyer. Let me explain to you why Rav Yochanan is stating that. Gavin, if my item is stolen, I think in all probability, if I have a suspicion who the thief is, I haven't given up hope of getting it back. The minute that thief puts it on Gumtree, I've got no hope of getting it back. And at that point, the change of domain from the thief to the new purchase on Gumtree preceded your Yush. And therefore, if the thief is put into interrogation and he says where he sold it to on Gumtree, the buyer can't claim that he's not prepared to return the item without compensation because what he's done is wrong. The only reason Yush took place on behalf of the victim is it was natural to give up hope when there was a third party. However, if the victim was prematurely despairing and gave up at the point where the thief had it, then the thief has acquired the article and he has to pay the original owner back that cash equivalent. But with that Yush and then a change of domain to the purchase on Gumtree, that belongs to the purchaser. And his claim is only against the thief should the change of domain occur before the Yush. But if the Yush occurs before the change of domain, in that particular case, in other words, where the owner despaired after the stolen property was in the possession of the buyer, then a change of domain, the buyer acquires the stolen property. So again, Rav Yochanan is saying if despair precedes a change of domain, it belongs to the buyer because it was premature for the original owner to despair at that point. And then his claim would only be against the thief. Now, according to Rav, it doesn't make a difference if Yush preceded a change of domain or superseded a change of domain. As long as there's Yush, the buyer acquires the stolen goods. And his legal argument is only against the thief. All right?
Okay. We've lost Arthur, by the way.
Arthur probably went to his client. That's probably why.
Just letting you know. Yeah.
Now I'm aware, but you guys are still in the share.
But Damon, point is, one has to be 100% certain that Yush has taken place by the owner. Before that should be the main issue. Obviously, unless the guys you say goes to Gumtree, the thief, and he puts it on Gumtree, and it goes out of the country, out to another
Yes, so that's
province. Then there's
exactly what
like,
we're saying. If the thief puts it on Gumtree and a person purchases it, and they haven't bought it from a legitimate store, that doesn't protect the buyer. He's got to return it. Okay, because
if the buyer can be traced.
Because the original only despaired at the point where it seemed unlikely to get his item back, and that wasn't premature fatigue. That was based on revealing of a new situation, and therefore the buyer doesn't acquire it on those sort of grounds. According to Rav Yochanan, according to Rav, as long as it's Jewish, it doesn't matter what order had happened in with the change of domain. In fact, it affects acquisition for the buyer, and that's it.
But the buyer, at the end of the day, the buyer should have, if he has to return this object to the original owner, then you said earlier, one of the opinions which I can't remember, then he has a claim against the thief. But the buyer should have some form of protection, either that
The buyer
or
only has a form of protection. He has a form of protection either way. In other words, if the thief's identity is undiscovered, because Kevin, you bought an item from the Rosebank flea market, everybody in that day bought items, and the guy disappeared, the vendor disappeared, but he was actually a thief that cleaned a house of items and was selling it at the Rosebank flea market, and you and another 80 people bought items from him, and he never appeared again at the Rosebank flea market, and they couldn't trace him. Then the remedy of the marketplace occurs, and if the original owner wants it from you, they're going to have to pay for it. Okay? But the minute the thief is discovered and the Rosebank flea market is able to trace who it is, because he left contact details and he wasn't the brightest thief, you as the purchaser have got a claim against the seller, the vendor at the Rosebank flea market, so that's your obligation to get your money back. It's not the original victim's or owner's responsibility to get him back, because you're much more to blame, because you should have checked that it was too good to be true, and therefore the original victim did nothing wrong. The buyer is complicit to a lesser degree than the thief, but certainly more so than the victim. So we're talking about whether or not the thief is identified or not. If he's unidentified, the remedy of the marketplace protects the buyer. If the thief is identified, the buyer has to sue the seller for his money back because he stole the item in order to sell it. That's all. Yeah, straightforward.
take that Paras point again, please. Sorry, my
So,
mind was drifting there.
no problem. So, Kev, if you bought something from the Rosebank flea market and 80
Yeah.
other people did and the vendor disappeared,
And that was
If you-
stolen goods,
the
obviously.
original owner wants it back, he has to pay money for it because you've got no recourse as the purchaser. But if the Rosebank flea market is able to give you and every other purchaser the details of the person that sold it to you, it's not the original victim's fault. It's up to you to get the money back from the seller. The original victim, you've got to give him the item irrespective. And your claim now is against the seller, inverted commas, the vendor of the Rosebank store, who happens to be the thief. Because when his identity is revealed, you've got some recourse as a buyer, Kevin. That's not the original owner's fault. Gav, are you asleep?
No.